Okay. So look at last Tuesday, we are making this transition talking about the end of World War II and all the different things that this cabal of people that we've been talking about did, some dozen things, and we had moved to the point of them creating the Central Intelligence Agency. And we touched on the special role that Robert Lovett played in this, one of the senior partners of Brown Brothers Harriman. He chaired a commission for Truman in which he strongly recommended the creation of a paramilitary organization that was capable of conducting covert operations, specifically focusing against the Soviet Union, and the special role that was played by William D. Pauley, another major hardcore multimillionaire right-winger, in authoring the Doolittle Commission report, in which he advocated that we establish a paramilitary group that was more ruthless in its techniques than any that would be deployed against us, and talked about the fact that in this game there could be no rules, and that we had to utilize whatever means were necessary to vanquish our enemies, and that the traditional standards of fair play the Americans esteem so highly needed to be disregarded and re-examined, and that there may come a point in time when the American people would have to be made familiar with and come to support what they referred to as this repugnant philosophy. Now we had jumped ahead and we talked about the role that was played in the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency by Allen Dulles, who became its first civilian director, who was in fact the legal counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman, which was the private investment group that was headed up by George Herbert Walker and his son-in-law, Prescott Bush, and involved such people as Robert Lovett and Robert Anderson and E.H. Harriman, the major railroad magnate, the DuPonts that owned the major chemical corporations and makers of explosives, John D. Rockefeller and David Rockefeller that owned Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of California, and J.P. Morgan and others, major financiers. This particular company, Brown Brothers Harriman, in their own promotions for themselves, said that they catered to the ultra-rich, high net worth individuals, and that were custodians of their money and advisors to their investments, and that they were the custodians of some $3.3 trillion, and they administered an additional $1.2 trillion, and that their objective was protecting capital and serving our clients, rooted deeply in the conservative culture, by their own terms. And what I started to leap ahead once we got to this point where there was the creation of this Central Intelligence Agency and its Covert Operations Directorate that was generated by National Security Directive 5412, that set up the 5412 committee that was in fact the overseer of these covert operations. But I started to leap ahead to the role that they played in and around the Cuban Missile Crisis in the immediate aftermath of this. But I want to just quickly go back and point out how consistently this Covert Operations Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency conducted itself immediately after its creation in 1947. They moved very aggressively in 1948 to get Truman to adopt the doctrine, which came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, in which they asserted that no government in the world should be allowed to exercise the folly of allowing the reins of their government to fall into the hands of socialists or communists, even if it were the desire of the majority of their own people. And that they used the Anderson Trust funds of the $1.2 trillion that had been the Secretary of War Stimson and his deputy secretaries of war in December of 1945 recommended to Truman that be placed in the hands of the senior partners of Brown Brothers Harriman, that they be the ones to make the decisions about the utilization of the income generated by this $1.2 trillion in gold, bullion, and platinum, and silver, and precious jewels. Thank you, Noah. And that they utilized this money, as we pointed out, to install fascists in mayor's offices and in national legislative offices all throughout Europe, and that they then, in 1952, when Truman's 2 terms had expired, Eisenhower was elected, and his Vice President Richard Nixon assumed the chairmanship of the 5412 Committee, and they began a very robust program of overthrowing governments around the world who were deemed not to be adequately supportive of the capitalist system, and specifically fostering and promoting the interests of their own capitalist system. Now, I had I guess I didn't bring that book with me, but there is there are two books. Oh, the brothers' books. There they are. That you may have come to discover that there are 2 different books called The Brothers. And one of the books, written by David Talbot, is about John and Bobby Kennedy, the brothers. And the other one, by Stephen Kinzer, is about the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. This, while coincidental, is quite revealing that these 2 pairings played an absolutely dominant role eventually in U.S. history. But before the Kennedys come into office, the Dulles brothers were in the ascendancy, and that two of the major operations that they choreographed, with Allen Dulles in the position of being the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and John Foster Dulles being the Secretary of State, one of the very first things they did is they organized a military coup against the government of Iran, because Mozadek, who was the president of Iran, had insisted upon having the oil fields of Iran belong to Iran, interestingly enough. Because as it turned out, at the end of World War I, there was a set of negotiations that went on, and the Churchill Committee, chaired by Winston Churchill, the Secretary for Colonial Affairs of the United Kingdom, as I told you, chaired this 22-person commission that actually drew the boundary lines of nation states that were superimposed over a traditional 1,000-year old tribal area of the Middle East, and superimposed these nation states boundaries on that territory, independent of the understanding of the tribal loyalties and enmities between them. And they superimposed these boundaries and then appointed a particular family to be the potentate in that region, and then struck a deal with the head of that family to give them anywhere from 3 to 10% of the oil revenues that were to be taken from that territory. They would give those revenues personally to that family in exchange for being able to keep from 97% to 90% of all of the profits that were generated by the sale of this oil. And what had happened is that in Iran, there was a popular uprising against the potentates that had been put into power by the Western allies. And the Pahlavi family was ousted from control. And the Mozadek government came into power. And it turns out there's a protracted section of this book on the brothers with regard to the Dulles brothers that goes from page, I guess it is 119 to about 137. As I started going through it, looking for a section to read to you, it just kept becoming obvious that this entire section was something that you should probably read, because it gives such a detailed and explicit account of how this whole thing happened. Is this one of them that we have on? I
believe so. I'm going to double check right now.
Okay, but let me just start reading. I'll control myself not to read the entire section here of all those pages, but you'll see how it starts to unfold. And it says, invitations to the Council on Foreign Relations for the evening of November 21st of 1949. This is while Dulles is still an assistant director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And the Council on Foreign Relations was a private club that was established by David Rockefeller, the heir to John D. Rockefeller, and the people that owned Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of California, and were private investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman, and whose law firm, personal law firm for the family, was Sullivan and Cromwell. And they have this thing called the Council on Foreign Relations, and it says, invitations to the Council on Foreign Relations for the evening of November 21st of 1949 said that the event would be, quote, a small private dinner. It was also the geopolitical version of a debutante's coming out party. Singly and in small groups, nearly 100 of the most powerful men in America strode out of the darkness and into the elegant salon on East 68th Street in Manhattan. Their host, Allen Dulles, who was balding and wore rimless glasses, greeted each of them. Nelson Rockefeller, the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, Nelson Rockefeller being one of the sons of John D. Rockefeller, along with David Rockefeller, the founder of the Council on Foreign Relations, it said Nelson Rockefeller, chairman of the Chase Bank, and a former assistant secretary of state was there. Henry Luce, the publisher of Time and Life, and also Fortune magazine, the fellow who earlier in 1941 had written the editorial in Time magazine called An American Century, aggressively advocating that the United States stay out of the war in Europe and allow Hitler to win and establish a fascist regime throughout Europe to function as the bulwark against Bolshevism. And the legendary Wild Bill Donovan, America's most famous spy master. We're all there. And Wild Bill Donovan is the man who ran the OSS that I told you about, that had been created during World War II. And it said, all had come to meet Allen Dulles' new protege, the Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi of Iran. The young Shah had just turned 30 and was living through a turbulent year. A few months earlier, he had been wounded in an assassination attempt. He attributed his survival to divine intervention and took it as a sign that he was fated by history to rule Iran. As he recovered, he cast about for a way to show the grandeur of his vision. Allen found him one. After years of law practice that bored him, Allen Dulles had finally acquired a client with global ambition that matched his own. It was a radically conceived new corporation, the Overseas Consultants Incorporated, formed by the owners of 11 large American engineering corporations that aimed to do nothing less than change the world by making themselves rich. The visionaries who ran OCI were looking for a country to transform. They settled on Iran, which the United States viewed as a strategic prize. Iran desperately needed development, and since it was receiving more than $50 million in oil royalties every year and had access to loans from United States investors, which you will discover were all private investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman. And they had access to loans from private investors in the United States, would be able to pay for their services. The elaborate OCA proposal to Iran, 5 volumes in length, envisioned huge-scale projects, including the building of hydroelectric plants, rebuilt cities, and new industries, all of which would be imported and owned from abroad. Mohammad Reza Shah, who had grown up mainly in Europe and knew very little of his homeland actually, was captivated but uncertain. The directors of OCI needed a special envoy to close the deal, so they hired the attorney Allen Dulles, chief counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman, who was a famed charmer as well as the former head of the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. In the autumn of 1949, Allen Dulles flew to Tehran and met with the Shah. He must have been persuasive, for soon after he returned home, it was announced that Iran had agreed to pay OCI, that is this Overseas Consultants Incorporated, $650 million, more than $500 billion, and this was in the early 21st century, to complete a massive 7-year enterprise. This would be the largest overseas development project in the history of the human family. It was the greatest triumph of Allen Dulles' legal career. For Sullivan and Cromwell, it opened up a new world of possibilities. OCI provided the King of Kings with a blueprint for economic revolution, was reported in Time magazine by Henry Luce, who was also in this meeting at that particular time. And for European and Western European and American businessmen, with a guide to a vast new area of untapped markets. 1 month later, Allen Dulles stood before his brethren at the Council on Foreign Relations and introduced his new friend. When the applause subsided, His Imperial Majesty spoke. He introduced himself as a committed Democrat who embraced progressive ideas and wished for no more power than the King of Sweden. As for Iran's future, it would be shaped by a 7-year development plan, which, as you no doubt know, has been drawn up with the aid of American consultants. My government and the people are eager to welcome American capitalists to give it all possible safeguards, the Shah told his audience. Nationalization of any industry will not be allowed to occur. During the question period, he added, Iran's resources are still virgin and are there still to be developed. This was what these lords of corporate globalism wished to hear. On that night, the American foreign policy elite accepted Mohammad Reza Shah as its Iranian partner. Allen Dulles had sealed a highly promising relationship. Since he had recently been to Iran, however, Allen Dulles knew that the Shah had not forthrightly described what was happening there. Far from embodying what he called democratic values common to our two countries, the Shah of Iran had become the chief enemy of Iran's democratic movement. Just weeks before he had flown to New York, a throng of protesters, angered by his attempt to pack Parliament by stealing the election, had marched to his palace, camped on the lawn, and vowed not to leave until he agreed to call a new vote. Not wishing to come to the United States with election rigging charges over his head, he agreed. That cooled the confrontation momentarily, but no one imagined that it was over. During his visit to Iran, Allen Dulles had not only sealed his friendship with the Shah, but had seen the frightening alternative. The democratic movement seemed a volatile group stirred on by others who opposed the Shah. Among those demagogues was the unchallenged leader. It was he who led the protesters onto the Shah's palace lawn, who denounced the royal privileges. He who directed every campaign against foreign influence in Iran. This was Allen Dulles' first close-up view of Mohammad Mozadek. Now, this is the man who leads the insurrection against them and establishes a democratic government in Iran, who renounces this contract, who says that they are not going to allow the OCI to have this contract. They're not going to pay them the $650 million. And what happened is that they challenged the Shah of Iran and overthrew them. They called a general strike under the National Front, who led the opposition to the OCI contract. And this is what happened when they overthrew the royalist Shah of Iran, who was the son of the Pahlavi family that had been established as the royal family in Iran by the 1922 Commission of Winston Churchill. What they began to do is they began to set up an overthrow, a military overthrow of the new government. Mossadeg's political alliance, the National Front, led the opposition to the OCA contract. During debates over the contract in Parliament, one National Front deputy warned that its cost could break the back of all future generations in Iran. Another argued that Iran should not blindly follow the advice of the foreign powers and should entrust its development not to their American advisors, but to trained Iranian experts who are qualified by experience. These speeches struck a patriotic chord, and in December of 1950, the Parliament, by refusing to appropriate funds for the project, killed it. This liquidated with a single stroke the giant endeavor with which Allen Dulles and OCI had hoped to earn great personal profits, and that would have been an ideal base for projecting American power and influence throughout the Middle East. So that what you see is in the reading of these details, and I would suggest that you read from 119 up to page 137, because it covers this particular overthrow of an elected parliamentary government in Iran to replace the elitist, royalist, authoritarian, fascist government of the Shah of Iran, as an example of the kind of things that Allen Dulles was succeeding in doing. And then he was the assistant director of the Central Intelligence Agency at the time. And he still continued to be a private lawyer in Sullivan and Cromwell, still continued to be the chief legal counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman, and was representing groups like this overseas consultant as a personal attorney while he was the assistant director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And so that there was never even any pretense that they were doing anything other than promoting the private financial capitalist interests of their own clients. The other, that was in 1953, they mounted that particular coup against Mozadek. And then in 1954, they mounted a similar military revolution against the government of Guatemala in Arbenz. You can find these are quite famous, even though I would guess that probably up until you're taking this particular class, you probably never even heard about it. That the United States Central Intelligence Agency had overthrown, through a military coup, both the Iranian government and the Guatemalan government in 1953 and 1954. And so that you had this process leading up to 1959, which we began to talk about on Tuesday, where the Cuban revolutionary government overthrew Batista in Cuba, who was this fascist dictator over Cuba, who was a business partner of not only Santos Trafficante, who was the Don of the Mafia in Havana, who was the partner with Batista in smuggling in the heroin that was made from the opium in the Golden Triangle by the Corsican Mafia and brought into there. And he was also business partners with Paul Helliwell, who was the executive director and CEO of the Southeast Asian Supply Corporation, which was the company that actually received part of the profits from the importation of the heroin and the sale of heroin by the mafia, by Trafficante and the people, and then transferred it to the International Business Corporation, which was the CEO of which was William D. Pauley, the guy who had written the Doolittle Report, advocating the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. And so this International Business Corporation was the one that was then using the money to purchase arms and explosives and ammunition, etc., to be secretly shipped over into China to be given to the Kuomintang, the so-called nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek, to actually oppose Mao in China and to try to establish a capitalist enclave in China so that the markets in China could be made available to the American corporations, the major ones of which were clients of Brown Brothers Harriman. So this was the setting that I discussed with you on Tuesday, when in fact the election of 1960 took place, and much to the surprise of Richard Nixon, who had been the 8-year vice president under Eisenhower and who had chaired the 54-12 committee throughout that period, overseeing these types of covert operations that were overthrowing democratically elected governments throughout the world, that when Richard Nixon was not elected, what happened is that the assassination team that Richard Nixon had asked Howard Hughes to put together for him back in June of 1960, as soon as Richard Nixon realized that he was going to be the nominee. It's very similar to what happened the other night. When you remember that as soon as Cruz pulled out of the election, which was announced right here in our class last Tuesday, as soon as Cruz pulled out of the primary election, everybody realized that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party. And the entire news dialogue changed entirely into now knowing that he was going to be the Republican nominee. Well, the same thing happened back in June of 1960 when Nelson Rockefeller withdrew from the Republican primary, and then everybody realized that Richard Nixon was going to be the nominee. And that's what had triggered Richard Nixon at the end of June of 1960 to contact Howard Hughes to ask him over the secret telephone that existed in the National Security Council in the 54-12 committee to the special consultant of the National Security Council, Howard Hughes, to set up this political assassination team to assassinate Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and these other 5 comandantes of the new Cuban revolutionary government. And that whole process that I talked to you about on Tuesday began to take place of Nixon imposing this ultimatum, posing this ultimatum to Fidel Castro, saying that if he didn't agree to refuse to have any diplomatic relations with China or the Soviet Union, that the United States was going to basically embargo them and attempt to overthrow them, which they proceeded to do through Operation 40 that we discussed. So this whole process was already well underway, along with this ultra-secret assassination team already being in place, being trained down in Oaxaca, Mexico, on the ranch of Clint Murchison Jr. down there, when John Kennedy gets elected in November of 1960. Now, at that time, when John F. Kennedy was elected, the cabal, this group of people that was the 50, 60 men who were the owners of a majority of the stock of the top 50 corporations in the country that were all clients of Brown Brothers Harriman and had the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell representing them. These people had every good reason to believe that John Kennedy was going to be a team player. Now, some of the reasons for that are as follows. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was in fact a criminal bootlegger that back during the Prohibition era ran booze from Canada into the United States, down into Chicago, into Illinois, and into Detroit. And therefore, he had relationships directly with the mafia, which in fact did exist. The organized crime syndicate existed. So Joseph Kennedy was close with, though not a made member of the mafia, he was close with people that were made members, like Sam Giancana in Chicago. And because of that, they believed that because the Central Intelligence Agency had this covert contract basically going with the mafia to control the export of opium to the Corsican mafia and the transformation of that into heroin and then brought down into Havana to be sold by the mafia and help fund the covert operations of the CIA, that relationship between the mafia and Joseph P. Kennedy would indicate that John Kennedy, when he became president, was going to be careful about doing anything against the mafia, which was good for them. They were happy to have that be true. And it would protect that contract and relationship they had in Cuba dealing with the heroin. Moreover, Joseph P. Kennedy had in fact attended the coronation in 1939 of Pope Pius XII, who was a out-and-out fascist. And Pope Pius XII is the one who has signed the Concordat with Hitler and with Mussolini and Franco in Spain, agreeing that the Catholic Church would not in fact take steps to oppose fascism in Europe, in exchange for which Mussolini gave the Vatican $89 million in returned sequestered funds that had been previously sequestered, and gave them title to the Vatican State in Italy. And so Pope Pius XII was a renowned fascist, and Joseph P. Kennedy, being an Irish Catholic, went to the coronation and celebrated it. And in fact, Joseph P. Kennedy was a very close personal friend of Joseph McCarthy. And Joseph McCarthy is the man that I mentioned to you again last week, that was the senator from Wisconsin, who in fact was mounting this major purge against all the liberals in government, in the State Department, in the Defense Department, inside senatorial staffs. And Joseph McCarthy was the guy who epitomized these people, and he was an active member of the Senate Committee on American Activities. There's a House Committee on Activities, and then they had the Senate Committee on Subversion. And he was a prominent member of that. And he was a close personal friend of Joseph P. Kennedy, John Kennedy's father. In fact, McCarthy used to be a guest regularly out at the compound in Massachusetts for the Kennedys that was out at Hyannis. In fact, he dated two of the sisters of John Kennedy. Eunice, he dated Eunice, and then Patricia, who later the one that married Bobby married Peter Lawford, the big famous people. The bottom line, that Joseph McCarthy was there at the compound dating their people, friend of Joseph P. Kennedy. There was every reason to believe that Joseph P. Kennedy was going to have the influence on John Kennedy. In fact, John Kennedy John F. Kennedy was brought by Joseph P. Kennedy to the inauguration or coronation of Pope Pius XII. So John Kennedy had been there in 1939. And John Kennedy, as a 20-year-old junior at Harvard College, had gone to Germany in the summer of 1937 with Hitler, rising into power. Remember, the agreement was struck in January of 1933 that he become chancellor. He became chancellor, the unchallenged leader of Germany in 1934. It was the whole operation of Hitler, the fascist Third Reich, was well underway by 1937. And John F. Kennedy went to Germany and visited Germany during that time and actually wrote in his private diaries that he thought that fascism was perfectly correct to be done by the people in Germany. And he said such things. There's a book that's published called Among the Germans, the travel diaries and letters of John F. Kennedy from 1937 to 1945. He said, fascism was the right thing for Germany. And he said that he had a very favorable impression of the new Germany under Hitler. And he said, and he actually visited Birken's Gardens and this special tea house that was built at the Birken Gardens by Hitler. And he said this in his diary: whoever has visited these two sites can easily imagine how Hitler will emerge from the hatred that is currently surrounding him to emerge in just a few years as one of the most important personalities that has ever lived. Okay? This is John Kennedy said that on August 21st of 1937 in his private diaries, which they now have, and you can find photostats of. On August 21st of 1937, he also said that in his diary, he said, the Nordic race certainly seems to be superior to the Romans, he said. And then he said, what really are the evils of fascism when you compare it to communism? So these are all personal comments that were made by John F. Kennedy in his private diary when he was just 20 years old in 1937 during the summer. And I say he went to the coronation of Pope Pius XII, the guy who signed the Concordat with the fascists. And the fact of the matter is that they had, and John F. Kennedy, back in 1952, when he was a congressman, these are just little things that I found out about, that John F. Kennedy, he went to a gathering in 1952 at Harvard College, where he had graduated from. He went to the 50th anniversary of the Harvard Spree Club, one of the dinner clubs, and someone got up in the meeting and compared Joseph McCarthy to Alger Hiss. And this is an account by Robert Amory, who said he was there at the dinner. And John Kennedy got up from the table and said, how dare you compare such a patriotic American to one who is just a traitor? Okay? Now, of course, McCarthy's the traitor, but he had it backwards at that time. And so he jumped and he walked out of the dinner in this big huff in front of everybody in 1952, and he was a member of Congress. Okay? And also, you need to remember that Bobby Kennedy was the minority counsel to the McCarthy Committee in the United States Senate, along with Roy Cohen, who is an absolute evil bastard, who I had the great privilege of debating on the radio one time, and told him he was such on the radio. But the bottom line is that Bobby Kennedy was the minority counsel for the McCarthy Committee in the United States Senate. So the people that were these fascists that were in this cabal, who had actually financed the rise of the Third Reich in Germany, and actually given the loans that were used to build the international capital, the center, headquarters for the fascist party, they all had every reason to believe that John Kennedy, when he was elected president in 1960, was going to be a team player. But as we've touched upon before, when he came into office, it was discovered and remember, during his campaign, he was attacking Richard Nixon for being soft on communism. That, in fact, he was allowing this communist state in Cuba to exist just 90 miles off the shores of America. And he challenged Nixon to be more aggressive against them. And played the anti-communist card against Nixon. So as I say, that they had every reason to believe he was going to be a team player. But when he came on board as the newly elected president and was told about the plan to actually transform Operation 40, which was the covert harassment going on against Cuba, to transform that into a full-scale invasion, in April of 1961, just 3 months after he'd been inaugurated, he refused to provide air cover for them and refused to allow the United States Marines to be sent in to support that operation. And in fact, even when the men, the Cuban exiles, were trapped on the beach and being destroyed by Fidel Castro's military, he refused under pressure to send in the Marines that, as I told you, had been in complete defiance of his orders, had been mobilized by the United States Navy under Arleigh Burke and positioned in ships off the shore of Cuba, getting ready to go in. And Kennedy ordered them to stand down. And so that was the first experience that the people had, that Kennedy was not potentially going to be a full-scale team player for them. And this continued on. As it turns out, that was in April of '61. On July 20th of 1961, the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Lemonster, in the Navy Admiral Arleigh Burke, and the Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff presented a proposal to Kennedy, July 20th, 1961, and there's a memo about this by this fellow named Burris, who was he was the aide to Lyndon Johnson, the vice president at the time. He was in the meeting, sitting in for Johnson. And in that meeting, the Joint Chiefs of Staff presented a Joint Chiefs of Staff approved plan to launch a sneak attack, a nuclear sneak attack against the Soviet Union. Just undertake a complete unilateral first strike against the Soviet Union, because they had calculated that the time was shortly going to be arriving when the strategic advantage that the United States had over the Soviet Union in their missiles would allow them to launch this first strike out of the blue, and that they could destroy such virtually all of the nuclear missiles of the Soviet Union. And whatever limited type of response the Soviet Union could undertake against the United States would be completely acceptable. And that we would have eliminated the communist threat in the world. And Kennedy was astonished that they had actually gone so far as to propose doing that. And he got up and walked out of the meeting. And then in March of 1962, this is less than a year later, the Joint Chiefs of Staff came back to him again in a meeting on March 16th of 1962, and they presented to him the proposal codenamed Operation Northwoods, in which General Lyman Lemonster, the chief of the Joint Chiefs, said that it was unanimously approved by the Joint Chiefs, proposing that the United States CIA organize a dressing up Cuban exiles from the Miami area who had fled back in 1959 and who'd been in residence working with Operation 40 since 1959. That what they do is they dress them up in Cuban military uniforms and attack the United States military base at Guantanamo and sink one or more U.S. warships that were there at anchor, and to kill a number of American Navy people there at the base, and to undertake military attacks in Miami against private civilians, preferably inside the anti-Castro Cuban refugee community, and that they blow up shopping malls in Miami. I mean, really attacking the heart and soul of America. You know, blowing up shopping malls in the United States and making it a point to kill Cuban refugees and exiles in the process, and proposed setting up a secret team to pose as Cuban terrorists to undertake military bombings in Washington, D.C., and so that they could then blame them for doing this. Could blame the Cuban government for doing this, and it would justify the United States military launching a military attack against the island of Cuba and eliminating them as a communist bastion in the Western Hemisphere. As a sub-part of this, they also proposed doing bombings in Jamaica and in Trinidad, Tobago, which is British territory, so they could also get the UK to participate in this, so that in fact it wouldn't be just a unilateral American attack against Cuba. Now, this is the kind of thing that they were engaging in. In Kennedy, when they made that proposal to him, he was furious, actually, in the meeting. And he got up and walked out of the meeting and told Kenny O'Donnell, his staff, he said, and one other person that was in the meeting, that, and these people call themselves human beings, who are proposing doing this. And he was completely offended, and he removed Lyman Lemitzer as the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for having repeatedly made proposals like this to him. And so that this is all set forth. Actually, there's a major documentary about these set of activities. It's called A President Betrayed, and it's narrated by Morgan Freeman. And you can get a copy of it from Agora Productions, and I can get you the address if you want to see that. But it's not on the internet. It doesn't. I haven't been able to find it, but I know where it is. Okay. Now, this was the kind of activities that were going on that led up to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, and I went through some of the details of that with you last Tuesday, to the point where Kennedy succeeded in conducting official communications back and forth with Khrushchev, and got an agreement struck that JFK would order the removal of the Jupiter missiles from Turkey if Khrushchev would stand down all the missiles in Cuba. And that particular deal was struck, and Kennedy then entered into his second iteration of giving his word of honor to Khrushchev that he would cease and desist from all further efforts to mount paramilitary attacks against the island of Cuba, this time actually meaning it, whereas he had lied about it back in April of 1961, a year and a half earlier. But now he gave his sincere word that he would stand down these attacks, and he gave the orders, as I told you, to the 5 paramilitary bases at which Operation 40 was running, at Swan Island and No Name Key, and the one in the Everglades, and the 2 of them at Lake Pontchartrain around New Orleans. He ordered them all to stand down, and when they defied him on December 3rd of 1962, Frank Sturgis and his anti-Castro Cuban exiles that were on No Name Key launched the attack against the Russian ship sitting in the harbor in Havana and sank it. As I told you, John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy sent in helicopter gunships with U.S. Marshals on them and burnt them out, and then did the same thing to the base in the Everglades that was under the command or coordination, I guess you could say, of E. Howard Hunt, the CIA liaison to those refugees. And we closed last Tuesday with the acknowledgement that these people who were in the paramilitary camps, those anti-Castro Cubans, were furious with Kennedy and viewed him as a traitor. And that the people, the 15 men that were on the S-Force that had been created at the request of Richard Nixon earlier when he was still vice president to assassinate Fidel Castro, they themselves wanted to kill the president because they viewed him as a traitor. Now, that's where we had gotten as of the close of our discussions last Tuesday. But the reality is that, and this is exactly what Santos Trafficante told us back in May of 1973 as one of our clients at the law office of F. Lee Bailey during the Watergate burglary that took place there. And I'll give you a little bit of the details on this, but it's all related to the fact that Santos Trafficante told us that he had put together the assassination team, gave us the details of it, which I've given to you in the last lecture, the stroke-by-stroke process by means of which this assassination team was put together, who was on it, where they were based, how they were funded, where they were trained, etc. But he tried to tell us in May of 1973 that in fact it was the S-Force themselves, the 15 individuals who were on the staff of the S-Force who decided they were going to kill the president. But you can imagine my surprise in May of 1973. This is 10 years after the assassination itself, but prior to the initiation of any type of reinvestigation of the Kennedy assassination, prior to their church committee hearings, which we'll talk about. Here I was being told in May of 1973 by Santos Trafficante, number one, that he had been asked directly by Richard Nixon, basically, back in June of 1960, to set up a political assassination team to kill Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the others. Number two, that he had set up such a political assassination team. Number three, that this political assassination team, all importantly, had in fact assassinated the president on November 22nd of 1963. He told us all three of those things, none of which anybody in their right mind would have said if it hadn't have been true. I mean, that would have been completely ridiculous for him to say something like that. But fourthly, what he tried to do was tell us that in fact it had been just the 15 men on the S-Force who had unilaterally decided to kill the president, had gone along ahead and killed him. Now, I completely believed number 1, 2, and 3. Number 4 was not convincing. That they had the wherewithal to do it, but they certainly didn't have the wherewithal to do it and get away with it, which is what they did. And so I can tell you a little bit about how we came to know this, and why would we have found this out in the context of the Watergate burglary. You know, so the question that you're all asking yourself right now, I can see you leaning out of your seats on this, and you know, what did this have to do with the Watergate burglary, right? That's what I see you leaning forward on this. So the bottom line is this, that remember now, John Kennedy is elected instead of Richard Nixon in November of 1960. Richard Nixon goes home and licks his wounds and tries to run for the governorship of California and loses, and basically everybody thinks he kind of disappears. But what he's doing is he's basically working inside the Republican Party from 1960, trying to figure out how to reconfigure the Republican Party so that he can, based upon the civil rights positions that were being taken by the Kennedy administration and then later followed up by the Johnson administration, that he wanted to take away the Southern Democrats and lead them into the Republican Party so that he could break that alliance that the Democratic Party had ever since the end of the Civil War with the Southern racists. And so he was engaged in what they call the Southern strategy, to take those Southern reactionary racists into the Republican Party. And but what happened is he laid in wait, and so when Kennedy was assassinated in 1960, in November 1963, and Lyndon Johnson came on to finish out Kennedy's first term, the last year, and then ran for his own term in 1964, and was there until 1968. You remember what happened is one of the very first things that Lyndon Johnson did when he came into office was he rescinded a number of the things that Kennedy was doing. Kennedy, from the time that the Bay of Pigs thing happened, he started taking these positions. Number one, he ordered the stand down of those military bases, those paramilitary bases. He launched the helicopter gunships against them to stop them. He opened up a back channel to Fidel Castro using William Atwood and another fellow by the name of Gene Daniel, two different people, to reach out to Fidel Castro to open up a back channel to them so that he could in fact try to normalize relations with Cuba. But very importantly, he started this back channel line of communications with Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union, in which Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged 18 extremely confidential letters using the ambassadorship of a fellow by the name of Norman Cousins. Norman Cousins was a journalist, the founder for 20 years of a thing called the Saturday Review. And he had access to Khrushchev. And he was the liaison that Kennedy used to establish these lines of communication through Pope John the 23rd. Because Pope John the 23rd was attempting to allay the kind of confrontation between the Catholic Church and Russia because of Russia's suppression of the Catholic Church. He was engaged in a major operation trying to placate the Soviet Union and get past this, so that Norman Cousins would go to Pope John the 23rd, and then he would go to the Soviet Union and deliver Kennedy's messages to Khrushchev, and then take Khrushchev's messages and come back to the Pope, and then take those messages to John Kennedy. And so that there was a mechanism that was set up by means of which JFK had this completely secret line of communication going on with Khrushchev. And what they were doing is they were both totally traumatized by the events that had taken place around the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was on the night of actually October 28th. I had misspoken and said that it was the 18th. Last time. I want you to correct that. It wasn't the evening of October 18th to 19th. It was the evening of October 28th or 27th and 28th, where these events took place with Curtis LeMay sending the U-2 flight over and sending the B-52s to the strategic fail-safe points, etc. But the bottom line is that Kennedy was so traumatized that I told you that he went through this metanoia type of experience that night of actually looking down into the abyss of total thermonuclear destruction of human civilization over this ridiculous argument about this one island. And the same thing had happened to Khrushchev. And so the two of them began this line of communications, and they both began to talk about the need to disassemble the nuclear warheads of the United States and the Soviet Union, and to have Pope John the 23rd act as the broker to assure the compliance with these agreements. And Kennedy, because of his Catholic faith and his belief that John the 23rd was a man of integrity, and because of the unique reality that Khrushchev himself thought that John the 23rd was a person of integrity, that there really was a genuine opportunity to have this work. And so they began this set of conversations to disassemble the nuclear warheads of the United States and the Soviet Union. And this whole process was going on. And then Kennedy came out and drafted a speech that he delivered at American University on June 10th of 1963. This is now into 63. This is basically 6 months into the period following the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He delivered a major speech, foreign policy speech at American University at the graduation, in which he very specifically stated that he wanted the Cold War to be over with the Soviet Union, and that we had to take steps to normalize our relations with the Soviet Union. And it drove the cabal crazy, this speech that he gave, because that while they didn't yet know at that point that he was engaged in this ultra-secret conversation with Khrushchev to disassemble the nuclear warheads, they did know that he was making these public speeches about eliminating the military power of the two of them. And then what happened is Pope John the 23rd issued a major papal encyclical called Pacem in Terris, in which he too called out for the elimination of nuclear weapons in the world. And so the cabal people started to recognize that there was a major parallel going on between what John the 23rd was saying in his papal encyclical and what Kennedy was beginning to say in his speeches. And so that they began to think, turns out correctly, that Kennedy and Pope John the 23rd were engaged in this process of trying to demilitarize the United States and the Soviet Union. And then it's almost certainly true that they got wind of these ultra-secret communications that were going on between Khrushchev and Kennedy, these 18 secret letters, and that it then dawned on them that Kennedy was actually engaged in a process of trying to disassemble the nuclear warheads of the United States. Now this is what I'm doing right now is I'm moving from this false assertion that was made by Santos Trafficante that it was just the 15 members of the S-Force, the rabidly anti-communist Cuban exiles who happened to be on that 15-man assassination team who unilaterally made the decision to assassinate Kennedy, to start to move step by step to try to understand that there's Percy Foreman once told me, Percy Foreman is one of the more famous criminal defense attorneys who's now passed away. But when I met him and was talking to him, he holds the record for having defended over 200 first-degree murder trials. And he's never had a person go to the electric chair. And he either got them acquitted or he got their sentences commuted. And I asked him one time, I said, you know, what is it that almost every great lawyer has some one particular line or theory that they pursue in the courtroom? What is your secret? And he said, when I'm defending somebody that's been charged with first-degree murder, what I have come to understand is that almost everybody who gets murdered usually deserves it. And if they deserved it from one person, they usually deserved it from more than one person. And so all I do is I put on in their defense all of the alternative theories of how this person could have gotten murdered. And I start to present, you know, how this person deserved getting murdered by all these different people. And so I present a reasonable doubt as to which of them actually committed the murder. And that's how we do it. And so that what it means is that in exploring a murder like this of Kennedy, what you start to do is to look to see who the people were that in fact had the motive to do this and had the capacity to do it and had the opportunity to do it. And so therefore it's perfectly clear that the S-Force, the 15 anti-Castro Cuban exiles that were on the S-Force, had the capacity to do this because they were trained specifically to do it. And that they were capable of doing it without anybody having authorized them to do that, because that's how they were organized. They were organized to be able to maintain deniability to the White House and to their superiors at the CIA and other places. But the fact is they could not have done this and gotten away with it and had it covered up as effectively as they did. So we begin to look for additional people that were involved and had reason to want Kennedy killed. And we come to this realization that Kennedy was not only stopping the anti-Castro Cubans from continuing their paramilitary operations, and not only had he fielded helicopter gunships against them and burnt them out, their bases, and arrested them under the Neutrality Act, but he in fact had opened a back channel to Fidel Castro to, quote, normalize relations and basically abandon his promise to them that the free flag of Cuba would fly over Cuba before the end of his second term. And so he had betrayed them. And so, as I say, that clearly presents a motive that they have to kill him. But when you discover that he is also engaged in this process of trying to undertake a unilateral process with Khrushchev of disassembling the nuclear warheads of the United States nuclear arsenal and the Soviet arsenal as well, all of the people who had put the time and energy into building the nuclear arsenal of the United States to the point where they actually thought that they had the ability to launch a first strike attack against the Soviet Union and flatten them and eliminate the communist threat from the world. That was how they perceived the degree of superiority that we had over them, that these people began to develop a desire to stop him from doing that. Because as President of the United States, he has the right to initiate treaties with other foreign countries. And all they have to do is bring the treaty that he negotiates and comes to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the United States Senate to get it ratified. But he does have the authority to conduct those types of negotiations. And so when they discovered that he was engaged in this type of activity with Khrushchev, they had a very serious reason for wanting to stop him. Because people will say to you, look, why in the world, if they wanted to get rid of him, why didn't they just wait a year until the elections of November of 1964? And then they could certainly mobilize to defeat him in the election, since they control the electoral process. And the answer to that is this, is that he was engaged in this type of process with Nikita Khrushchev, and he had actually presented to the United States Senate a partial nuclear test ban, banning all nuclear testing in the atmosphere, and had actually gotten it approved by the Senate. And now he was continuing to engage in this other process of disassembling the nuclear warheads. So this gives you a second group of people who had a motive to potentially terminate him, to stop him from doing this. And the reason that we found out about it was that it went this way, is that when Kennedy was killed and Johnson came on, you saw that one of the things that Kennedy had done, Kennedy had issued a National Security Action Memorandum, number 239, in which he had directed the Secretary of State to begin a negotiation with the Soviet Union through formal channels to undertake complete nuclear disarmament. And he'd also signed National Security Action Memorandum 263. The first one was 239. The second one is National Security Action Memorandum 263, ordering the initiation of withdrawing U.S. military forces from the Soviet or from Vietnam. and that this was another, what he could see he was doing step by step, he was stepping back from the confrontation that had developed over the course of the entire Cold War with the Soviet Union. He was taking the U.S. missiles out of Turkey. He was starting the withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Vietnam. He was calling for the elimination of nuclear testing in the atmosphere, and he was engaged in normalizing relations with Cuba. All of this was taking place just in the first 6 months after the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because of the extraordinary moment that had come that night of the 27th and 28th of November, of October, when the entire human family came to the very brink of thermonuclear holocaust. In fact, there's an account that came out later that there was a nuclear submarine, a B-59, they call it B-59 submarine, in the USS Beale, tracked it off the coast of Cuba during the blockade, and in fact had dropped a mini depth charge at them, notifying them that they knew they were there and were prepared to drop a depth charge on them. And they had a 15 megaton nuclear torpedo on board that submarine. And in fact, the captain of the submarine said that if they dropped one more depth charge at them, that he was going to fire the nuclear torpedo against the United States. A 15 megaton bomb. And there was a guy on board, just so you'll know, there was his assistant to the captain. His name was Vasil Arkhipov, V-A-S-I-L, something to always have in your notes, A-R-K-H-I-P-O-V, Vasil Arkhipov. And he is the one that talked the captain of the Russian submarine out of firing the torpedo. Because if he had done that, it would have triggered a thermonuclear exchange without any doubt at all. And so that's how close they came to thermonuclear war. Because, as I told you, that Curtis LeMay had gone to DEFCON 2. He had put airborne an eighth of all of our 1,436 bombers were airborne at the time. We had 145 U.S. intercontinental ballistic missiles armed and prepared to be fired. We had 23 SAC bombers, B-52 bombers, that had been sent to their fail-safe points all around the Soviet Union. And the U-2 had done the overflight that I told you about. So that's how close we were to coming to a total thermonuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. And Kennedy had been so traumatized by this that he had in fact started to take these steps in those first few months after the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was freaking out the entire constabulary. And more importantly, it was freaking out this cabal of these 50 to 60 men who had everything invested in being able to maintain nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union. And so what happened at that time was that this plan started to develop. First, on the part of the S-Force itself, the 15 men were trying to figure out the feasibility of actually assassinating the president. And then there's going to be people that are immediately above them who are their liaisons on these bases. Remember, I told you these 15 men were spread over the 5 paramilitary bases. And we know that the 2 most aggressive of these 5 bases were Frank Sturgis's group on No Name Key, who actually defied the president on December 3rd of '62 and attacked the Russian ship in the harbor, and the group that was in the Everglades that were under E. Howard Hunt. These are the 2 most aggressive groups that existed. And these people is where 3 to 6 of the members of the S-Force were based. Okay, so this S-Force would have started figuring out how they could go about assassinating the president. But then their liaisons, such as E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, would have found out about this, and then they're going to have to decide what their superiors, David Atlee Phillips and others, would do about all of that. And what happened is, we'll hold it right there at that spot, but this process is going on. That we know that so far in everything that we've covered. And what happened is you go fast forward to the point where Lyndon Johnson becomes president, serves out the final year of Kennedy's term, for his first term, and then runs for re-election in 1964 against Barry Goldwater, beats him 60-40, and then has his own term from 1964 to 1968. And he sets aside, he right away issues an order, National Security Action Memorandum 273 by Lyndon Johnson, on November 26th of 1963, one day after the funeral of JFK. He issues National Security Action Memorandum 273, setting aside National Security Action Memorandum 263 of Kennedy's that was signed on October 11th of 1963, ordering the removal of the U.S. military forces from Vietnam, starting with the first 1,000 of them, planning to have all 16,000 basically removed by the end of 1965. And so these steps start being taken by Lyndon Johnson. He accelerates the war. He's actually quoted by one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of saying, look, just get me elected here in 1964 and you can have your war in Vietnam, which he then did by completely falsifying the Bay of Tonkin incident, which has been totally verified now in the Pentagon Papers through the internal memoranda that we found and got published in the New York Times. The bottom line is he serves out that 64 to 68 term, and then we've mentioned it in passing. He, in January of 1968, in the first primary, at that time was in New Hampshire, he almost lost the Democratic primary election in New Hampshire to Eugene McCarthy, and then withdrew from the 1968 presidential election, and Bobby Kennedy announced his candidacy. And Bobby Kennedy was absolutely transparently on his way to be the Democratic Party nominee. It was going to be defeating Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon would have been defeated by the second Kennedy in a row, except that Bobby Kennedy is assassinated on the morning of June 6th, the morning after the California primary.
Do we know who assassinated him?
That's a separate issue. We'll deal with that later. Okay? So the bottom line is that this whole history plays itself out, and Lyndon Johnson withdraws from the election. Kennedy announces his candidacy. He's assassinated, and then coming in second place to Bobby is Hubert Humphrey, and there is this extraordinary convention in Chicago in 1968 that you probably have all heard about, where the tens of thousands of baby boomers all came to the convention, surrounded the convention, and tried to get them to pass a plank opposing the Vietnam War and withdrawing U.S. military forces as Kennedy wanted to. And Hubert Humphrey wouldn't do it. But Hubert Humphrey ended up losing that campaign to Richard Nixon by, again, a little more than 1% of the popular vote. Richard Nixon comes into the presidency in 1968 and serves out his first term. It goes from 1968 to 1972, and then they enter into the 1972 presidential election. Okay, they go into the 1972 presidential election, and everybody assumed that Nixon was going to win. The Democratic Party was in the process of nominating George McGovern to be the Democratic nominee, a very progressive Democratic senator from South Dakota. And Richard Nixon was confident that he was going to win until the Democratic Party replaced the head of the Democratic National Committee and put into that position Larry O'Brien. Lawrence O'Brien was suddenly selected to be the head of the Democratic National Committee to head up the planning of the presidential campaign against Nixon, and Richard Nixon became terrified at this point because Larry O'Brien, prior to his having been named to be the head of the Democratic National Committee in 1972, had been for over 20 years the chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for Howard Hughes. And Richard Nixon, knowing what he knew about what the transactions were that had taken place back in June and July of 1960, knew that it was Howard Hughes that Nixon had reached out to establish the assassination team that had actually been the team that assassinated President Kennedy. And so he was terrified that Larry O'Brien might have found out about this in his capacity as the Washington lobbyist for Howard Hughes. And so Richard Nixon ordered the burglary of the Watergate Hotel. There's always been lots of speculation about that, but it turns out that it's completely true. That he actually instructed Jeb Magruder to instruct the Watergate burglars, the plumbers unit that they had in the White House, to burglarize the Democratic National Headquarters and to wiretap the telephones of Larry O'Brien and bug his office, because Nixon wanted to find out, A, whether Larry O'Brien knew about the fact that Richard Nixon had played the role in creating the assassination team that was originally assigned to assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara, etc., and the fact that did he know that this was the group that had assassinated President Kennedy? And thirdly, was he planning to use that information in any way in the 1972 presidential campaign? This is what Nixon wanted to find out by sending the Watergate burglars into the Democratic National Headquarters. They'd gone in, they'd placed the wiretaps in the phone bugs, and one of the phone bugs had gone dysfunctional. And so they were ordered to go back in, so that on the night of June 17th of 1972, that they were actually engaged in going into the Watergate Hotel simply to replace one of the bugs in one of the telephones. And they went back in to the Watergate Hotel, and in going in, they taped the door going into the Watergate Hotel, where you go into that entrance to go up to the Democratic National Headquarters. And they were up there working at getting the bug replaced in the phone, and the night watchman at the Watergate Hotel came around and found the tape on the door. And he took the tape off the door and closed the door and locked it. And then went back on his rounds and went around the rounds. And one of the burglars came downstairs checking the perimeter and discovered that someone had taken the tape off the door. And so he put the tape back on by just closing the lock and taping it closed so the door could be open like that. And so he went back up, and they were continuing to replace the bug and work at the office. And the night watchman came back around and discovered the tape back on the door. And so he calls the police, calls the Washington, D.C. police. The Washington, D.C. police discover that the closest people they have to the site is actually a team that is out on a surveillance that's under the command of Carl Schlaffer, who's the head of the Washington, D.C. Organized Crime Strike Force, all in plain clothes, and they contact them and send them into the Watergate Hotel. And they come sneaking up on the Watergate Hotel, and it turns out that the people coordinating the burglary at the time, E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis at a nearby hotel from the balcony, can see these guys coming in, all dressed up like hobos and kind of street people, and they report to them in the Watergate Hotel that there's this group of people that look like hippies coming into the building. And so that they don't quite respond fast enough. And so Schlaffer and his whole group goes up and catches them all red-handed in the Watergate Hotel. And there is James McCord, who's the wiretap specialist. And there's 3 Miami-based anti-Castro Cubans there, all of whom were members of the S-Force. And the 4 of them are arrested there on the site. And they find in Bernard Barker's pocket, Bernard Barker is one of the guys, along with Orlando Martinez, that they find a check in his pocket. And the check has been drawn on the Banco Internacional down in Mexico City on this one particular account of an attorney by the name of Ogario. And they've got them under arrest, and they bring them to the arraignment, and they arraign them for this crime. And it turns out that Bob Woodward, a young reporter that had just started recently with the Washington Post, is there covering the beat, and is there when they're arraigned. And he hears James the McCord, when asked who his employer is, he says that his employer is the Central Intelligence Agency. And so does one of the other burglars. And so Bob Woodward thinks this is a bit of a story, or at least a curiosity. And he goes back to the Washington Post and tells Ben Bradley. And you can see the entire story of this, which is quite accurate in its recounting. It called All the President's Men. It's a book that was written by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and it was then transformed into a movie that was starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. So this event starts to take place, and the Washington Post starts pursuing the information, and they start filing stories about all this, and the thing starts to come unwound. And so that there's a series of very significant meetings that start taking place. Nixon at this time is down in Key Biscayne, down at his place down there with Bibi Rebozo, and he gets word of this, and he comes back up to Washington, D.C. The burglary is on the night of the 17th, and there's a meeting that takes place on the morning of June 21st of 1972. And Bob Haldeman, who is the chief of staff for Richard Nixon, comes into Richard Nixon's office at the Oval Office after Nixon has returned from Key Biscayne, and he says, "Mr. President, I think we've got a problem here." And Nixon says, "What is it, Bob?" He said, "Well," he said, "John Dean, who was the White House counsel, legal counsel, has just been contacted by Pat Gray, who is the new head of the FBI, because J. Edgar Hoover had just died a couple months earlier. So this young, inexperienced, or younger, inexperienced guy is the head of the FBI. He has just called over and talked to John Dean and said that they have found this check in the pocket of Bernard Barker, one of the burglars, and it's drawn on this account down in Mexico City at the Banco Internacional. And he's being pressed by people in the FBI, specifically Mark Felt, who is the deputy director of the FBI, who was hoping he would have been appointed to be the new head of it, but had not been. He'd been passed over, and this guy, L. Patrick Gray, had been named. But Mark Felt was pressuring Pat Gray to authorize Mark Felt himself to go down to Mexico City to investigate this particular bank account. And so L. Patrick Gray had called up and asked John Dean to talk with the president to find out if this is going to cause any problem for the White House. And Richard Nixon says, "Bob, I want you to go get a hold of John," which is John Ehrlichman, his domestic counsel, "and I want you and John to go over to the agency over at Langley, and I want you to go over to see Dick Helms, the director of the CIA, and Vernon Walters, the deputy director, and tell them to contact the FBI and tell them to get the hell out of this part of the investigation right now." And there's a big pause. And then Bob Haldeman says, well, what am I supposed to have them say to the FBI that'll cause them to get out of the investigation? And he said, you just have them tell them that if they don't get out of this part of the investigation right now, all of the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could all come out. There's another big long pause, and then Bob Haldeman says, well, will they know what that means? And Nixon said, oh yes, they'll know what that means. And so they did. And they went over and they confronted Bob Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman went over and they saw Dick Helms and Vernon Walters, and they said exactly that to them. Dick Helms made the call to the FBI and ordered them to stand down from going down to Mexico and checking out that part of the investigation. So that's where we'll leave it right now. So that becomes known as the smoking gun conversation. And just in closing on this, we can have some more questions for the next 15 minutes, and we'll go have our longer discussion. But I'll just point out ahead that when the Senate Select Committee investigating the Watergate burglary was in session, and Bob Haldeman was on the stand, and they had the White House Oval Office tape recordings of that conversation, that when Bob Haldeman said to Richard Nixon, well, will they know what that means if they don't get out of this part of the investigation, all the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could all come out? And Haldeman said, well, will they know what that means? And Richard Nixon said, oh yes, they'll know what that means. The chairman of the Select Committee, Senator Sam Ervin from North Carolina, said, what did that mean? And Bob Haldeman said, I believe they were talking about the assassination of President Kennedy. Okay, so that's the lecture so far today, and we'll get to the rest of it next week. We'll start talking about what did all that mean, what's happening in this thing.